I think it's safe to say that at this point in his career, Guillermo del Toro is the eminent master of monsters. Since he started making movies, he's been obsessed with the grotesque in a way that I can definitely sympathize with.
If there's not a monster on my call sheet, I won't show up to shoot.
And so far, that's only been a good thing. From Hellboy to Pacific Rim to, most recently, The Shape of Water, Del Toro creations have creeped into the cultural consciousness with the ease of the extremely well-made. I'm making sure to give those monsters a fair mention, because this video isn't about them. Seated at the head of a massive banquet that our 10-year-old hero Ophelia is instructed not to touch, the Pale Man comes alive the moment she takes a grape on her way back home. He stuffs his bloody eyeballs into empty sockets in his hands, eats 2 of the fairies Ophelia brought along as guides, and chases her down the hall, from which she very narrowly escapes. That's it. That's his scene. The Pale Man appears in Pan's Labyrinth for just under 7 minutes in an entirely self-contained sequence within a 2-hour movie, and yet my guess is that when most people think about Pan's Labyrinth, the Pale Man is one of the first things that comes to mind. To this day, it might be Del Toro's most memorable creation, a brief but crucial part of the movie that solidified his status as a master of modern fairy tales. In one monster, Del Toro materialized the horror of human violence and greed, mashing together politics and basic human fears and wrapping it up into one insane, extremely effective character design. We'll get to all that in a minute, but first let's talk about the color white. When making a monster, white is not the color a director normally goes for. In Western society, we're used to paleness in stories as signifying virtue and purity, but there are plenty of cultures around the world where that isn't the case at all. In certain East Asian and African cultures, the color white is a symbol of death, unhappiness, and disease. Thinking from outside our own cultural history of Snow White and white wedding gowns and white doves and white knights and white flowers and white flags, this symbol makes sense too. White might indicate cleanliness and peace or whatever in some circumstances, but it's worth considering that white is also the absence of color, the thing that remains when everything else, including life itself, has gone. So here we are, looking at an ogre the color of death. But that's not where the importance of his skin tone ends. Del Toro hasn't exactly been light-handed about the significance of this monster being a pale man. As recently as last year, he's brought up the monster in connection to today's political climate, composing one of my top 5 all-time favorite tweets: "These are Pale Man times." Clearly he sees more than a few institutional figureheads in both past and present that resemble it. Metaphorically, guys, I mean metaphorically. Don't be so immature. As a film, Pan's Labyrinth is structured as a fairy tale, but that definitely does not make it a kids' movie.
Well, I believe that fairy tales are a way for us to understand the world. I mean, they were originally intended to be for adults, and then eventually, through the ages, once they were compiled by the Grimm brothers especially, they became children's literature. But originally, they were created to tackle sort of inner struggles in the outside, in a fable.
Del Toro is clearly relying on a number of old fairy tale tropes here, namely that of the child-eating monster found in most cultures around the world. Let's stop for a second to appreciate how dark that is. The lesson in creatures like Krampus, La Llorona, or the witch in Hansel and Gretel is essentially that kids shouldn't stray too far, trust strangers, or disobey their parents because the world is a horrible place that will devour them alive if given the opportunity. If that's not a relevant lesson for Ophelia, I don't know what is. Spain's civil war is a dangerous setting for anyone to find herself in, let alone a sensitive, book-reading girl whose family is falling apart. Everybody notices the similarity between the Pale Man, sitting at the head of a feast no one can touch, and Ophelia's fascist stepfather, Captain Vidal, sitting at the head of his own feast while Spain starves around him. The Pale Man guards a banquet he won't touch and no one else can have, grotesquely ignoring the food to eat anyone tempted by it. Captain Vidal might eat the food in front of him, but his feast is just as much of a gross reversal of what a table full of food is meant to represent in terms of community and sharing. a reflection of the greed of fascist Spain, which hoarded resources and slaughtered those who sought them out. But let's not kid ourselves. It's not enough to be reminded of the brutality and greed of fascism. The Pale Man is scary because, oh my god, look at him! But it's a strange kind of fear he inspires, because everything horrifying about the Pale Man is basically an amalgam of handicaps. He looks frail and old, and the eye thing means either his vision or hands are compromised at all times. He's even naked, the ultimate vulnerability. For the initial design, Del Toro had one specific instruction for his art directors.
I asked them to sculpt him like they were sculpting an old man that lost a lot of weight. And when the sculpture arrived, I did a sketch of it and I removed the face.
This design implies a history to this monster. The idea that he was once very fat, that someone painted those murals behind him and cooked that food. A constant reference to a normalcy that the Pale Man may once have embodied, and an appearance of having rejected that normalcy for something else. His character design is full of vulnerabilities, but those vulnerabilities can also be described as indignities. Things like nakedness and facelessness mark the Pale Man as not belonging to human society as we know it. It's not an uncommon tactic in fairy tales to represent sins against human decency as physical ugliness. But Ophelia lives in the real world, and in the real world, it isn't so easy to tell the evil from the good by appearances alone. It isn't until she enters the magical realm that the rules of the fairy tale are allowed to kick in and truly manifest Del Toro's image of institutionalized greed and violence gone unchecked. There are two monsters in Pan's Labyrinth, and the one is just the soul of the other made real. For all of Captain Vidal's vanity and order, the Pale Man reveals what his ideology turns him and people like him into. Something deformed, decaying, blood-soaked, and always, always hungry. A corruption of human nature. A creature who can't see anything unless it's reaching out to grab it. He stuffs his bloody eyeballs into empty sockets in his hands, eats two of the fairies. Oh my god!